and welcome to Close Walk Catholic Communications. I'm Father Bayer, your host, and today we're taking a little bit of a different look at things. I'll be 72 years old this year, and when I was in college, the president declared a war on drugs. How's that working for us? It's not. Why? Because we decided we would chase the drug and we would never address the issue. Why were people so unhappy, so disenfranchised, so miserable that they needed to get high, get buzzed, get drunk, whatever it was, their drug of choice? We never address that societal ill of people being unhappy with their life and their circumstances and their reality. And we're still losing that war. You've heard me say this before, but today, in 2025, there are 50 million slaves worldwide, according to the United Nations. In 2025, we have more slaves in the world than we had in the 400 years of legal African slave trade. And those 50 million slaves are sold into sexual slavery, labor, organ procurement. That is, a person in a first world country ends up, needing a kidney. They can't find a donor. They find him somewhere in a third world country. Someone gives the donor $2,000 for a very sloppy operation, and they sell the kidney for $150. And then in extremely poor situations, they have forced marriages. A 13-year-old little girl will marry a 50-year-old man for the dowry in that culture. The reality is today, because of our ability financially, the United States consumes 10% of the world's slaves. You know what that means? Every day in the United States, 5 million people are bought and sold. Primarily labor trafficking, but the majority, 85%, is into the sex trade. And of that group of 85% sold into the sex trade, 60% of that are under the age of 18. And of those under the age of 18, we always think of people being kidnapped in a white van and pulled up. 45% in this country are sold by their primary caregivers, their own families. And of the primary caregivers who sell their own children, 65% of them are their mothers. You'll hear a lot of stuff today about human trafficking. Oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. Well, we have more than 5,000 animal rescue shelters in this country, each one holding 100 to 1,000 animals. As of November 2024, for the 5 million people bought and sold in this country every day, we have 940 beds. I have 12 of them. Something's wrong. Now, I work a lot with law enforcement, and they'll be the first ones to tell you that the traffickers are one step ahead of us with technology at every step. And so we need to talk about, certainly we need to catch the traffickers and pull the children away from that life. But we need to ask the question, why are we so perverted? Pornography is a $152 billion a year industry. You know what that buys you? It buys you an NFL franchise, the FIFA World Cup franchise, and takes every 18-year-old in this country and sends them a 4-year full ride to Stanford University. $152 billion for pornography. And why, we have people insisting that we use their preferred pronouns, and we have 3 million children being bought and sold in this country every day. And, of these kids that are being sold, they're like they don't exist. No one wants to do anything about it. Our government, last administration, told us we have 340,000 unaccompanied minors in this country. I guarantee you 330,000 are being trafficked. And we're turning a deaf ear. So the question is why have we slouched in our society where we've started to look at the human life as a matter of profit, pleasure, or possession? Why are we there? Why has our integral human dignity been so objectified? You might want to think that, well, if this president, that president, this political party, that political party. I got very strong political beliefs, but I'm not talking about politics today. The devaluation of the human person didn't start with the last administration or the one before, even the last century. It started long before. 1798, there is a self-proclaimed preacher by the name of Thomas Malthus who starts to advocate for the population principle. The population principle was basically this. In 1798, we did not have enough resources for us to live the way we want to. And unless we start to tell people to limit the number of children that are born, people will exceed our resources, and we need to start limiting the number of children that people can have. This is 1798. You fast forward to 1854, and Charles Darwin arrives on the scene with the origin of the species, but part of that was the survival of the fittest. Anyone who's ever watched a National Geographic program knows the slowest in the herd gets eaten first. And so he starts advocating, 1854, that we need to make sure we don't have too many slow people in the herd. Of course, this is right on the eve of the very shameful Civil War in the United States, the North versus the South. But one of the things that happened was the Emancipation Proclamation. And now these African slaves who've been brought over here have supposedly won their freedom. Well, when that happens, there's a group that's born called the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan wanted the slaves to know they may be free, but they're not equal. And from 1865 to 1872, the Ku Klux Klan in this country started to terrorize the freed slaves. And there are many, many tales of the injustice that were perpetrated upon people who were former slaves. There are many tales of the intimidation and the fear that happened. But the Ku Klux Klan at that time was relatively short-lived. In 1883, a cousin of Charles Darwin, by the name of Sir Francis Galton, starts to develop a concept from the Latin word eugenes. Eugenes in Latin means good stock. He coined the term eugenics, and he starts to advocate for the thinning of the herd, that we don't need these people who can't carry their weight. That's not necessary for the herd to take care of. And then in 1897, a minister by the name of Havelock Ellis comes on the scene and starts talking about our oneness with God is dependent upon our ability to experience our full sexual potential. So there were all kind of experimentations, prostitution, pedophilia, homosexuality. But it was through this that we were going to be able to reach our sexual potential. And therefore, in that ecstasy, we can really come to know God. At that time, there was a little known member of his congregation by the name of Margaret Sanger. And Margaret Sanger, some people say, well, more than just a member of his congregation. Nonetheless, this gave birth to a whole different cultural change. Now, what I want you to understand is at the beginning of the 20th century, that was a great immigration to this country. Italians, Irish, Poles, Jews, everybody was coming to this country, right? Well, that did not sit well with the purebloods, okay? That did not sit well with those who thought they should have been the Mayflower family. But the one thing that's happening is we are now redefining the human being. Psychology sees man as rational animal. Theology sees man as rational animal with a soul. That's the big distinction. I've got the doctorate in psychology, but just because we're rational animals doesn't mean we can experiment on human beings devoid of the presence of God in our theological understanding. Well, so we enter into the 20th century with all these foreigners coming in, and they're starting to populate. And Margaret Sanger was very quick to say that if we don't do something, there can be more of them than there are of us, and that's going to create a problem. Now, Margaret Sanger was one of these people who realized that you can't simply advocate the elimination of people. You can't advocate killing them. But, so you had to do a cultural change. And that cultural change was to start to empower women. That, realizing at that time women couldn't vote. We were going to later see the suffragette movement in which women very rightfully gained the right to vote. But she was looking at women's freedoms. And in looking at women's freedoms, she started to try a cultural shift. And I need to get in this, but we'll have to do that after the break. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Hi, I'm Father Jeff Baye from Closer Walk Catholic Communications. Thank you for being here today, and a special thanks for the support that you give us. First of all, your prayerful support we so desperately need, and also your financial support. We are donor-driven, and that is what keeps us on the air today. As you well know, the truth is in great demand and in very short supply, and mainstream media is not going to bring you the truth of the Gospels of our Lord Jesus Christ because that's not socially acceptable and it's not politically correct. Certainly we all realize that when this life journey's over, we don't stand before the Supreme Court, we stand before the throne of God. Therefore, with great clarity and great charity, to pronounce the truth of the gospel is important. Your prayers, your financial support enables us to do that. So we thank you, and may God bring you closer in your walk with the Lord each day. God bless you. Hello, and welcome back to Close Walk Catholic Communications. I'm Father Baye, your host. We're glad you returned. We ended with the introduction of a lady by the name of Margaret Sanger, who's popularly known as the mother of birth control and the mother of Planned Parenthood. But seeing that there were so many immigrants being born, she decided that we needed to limit that. In 1915, she went to Indiana and met with the group that repopulated and reformed the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan had a very intentional desire. There were blacks, Catholics, Jews, and Slavic people, that they wanted to make sure that we didn't have too many of them. Well, Margaret Sanger, in her effort to change the culture, she says that no woman can ever have total freedom until she has complete control of her body. If you watch the pro-life movement these days, the term my body, my choice, that began at the beginning of the 20th century with empowering women. Now, in an effort to keep women from being enslaved in the homes, she decided to open up her first abortion clinic. Very incidentally or coincidentally, in an all-Italian neighborhood of Brooklyn. Her second abortion clinic was opened in the all-black section of Harlem. All the time talking about the freedom of women, but in reality, making sure too many of those, they call them undesirables back then. Today we're deplorables, but back then they were undesirables. And so with that, Margaret Sanger tried this cultural change, and in the name of women's freedoms, she advocated the destruction of the unwanted. The unwanted. And that one of her great statements was, I think the greatest sin any person can ever commit is to bring a child into the world when that child doesn't have a chance to be fully human. Fully human? I mean, because of their color, their race, their gender, they can't be fully human? I'll remind you of Abby Johnson, the young pro-abortionist who was converted to pro-life, and in an on-stage debate, when they were calling it a fetal blob, she said, no, it's a living human being. And they said, okay, it's living and it's human, but it's not fully a person. Ask that to 6 million Jews during Nazi Germany, how that definition worked out for them. Also during this time, Margaret Sanger had some political support. Woodrow Wilson, the president in 1911, decided to talk about forced sterilization for the undesirables. It never made its way through the Congress. It never became a law. But now we're starting to see this rational animal and starting to see people as objects and starting to see people as economically good or bad. Then, Margaret Sanger goes on to be the mother of birth control and the mother of Planned Parenthood. Now, with her newfound term from Thomas Galton, eugenics, she goes on to meet with Joseph Mengele. Joseph Mengele, as you may or may not know, was the great medical architect of Nazi Germany trying to recreate the great Aryan race. If you've ever seen The Boys in Brazil, it's a very old movie, but that's the whole story of Joseph Mengele trying to create a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, great Aryan race devoid of the undesirables. That's why homosexuals, that's why retarded people, that's why gypsies, that's why all these people in Nazi Germany were interned and later gassed. So we move out of this Margaret Sanger mentality, and now the Thousand-Year Reich under Adolf Hitler is given birth. And that idea of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler wanted to present to the whole world how wonderful this was. And so he hosted the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, trying to show the strength of the great Aryan race and the great athleticism. What he didn't plan on was an African American by the name of Jesse Owens going over there and blowing everybody away. Now, Adolf Hitler, in his effort to create a false vision of Nazi Germany, presented the medals to every medal winner in the Olympics, except Jesse Owens. He was not about ready to give a black man a gold medal. Jesse Owens comes back to his native country, and I know this because a girl I dated, her dad was a 1936 track Olympian. And all the Olympians got invited to the White House by FDR because of their great success. All of the Olympians except Jesse Owens. Now we're starting to see where certain people are worthwhile, certain people are considered having value, and others are considered expendable. World War II is over. And now we're supposedly starting, the greatest generation. They're coming home from the war. They're building houses. They're starting industry. Everything is booming in the United States. And in 1951, at the University of Indiana, a guy by the name of Alfred Kinsey, who was a professor, decided to create the Sex, Gender, and Reproduction Clinic. And what he did was he studied, human sexuality, including prostitution, including homosexuality. And there was a great study done on young males to see at what age they could achieve an erection, even going down to the age of 3. They were doing experimentation. Well, the Kinsey report for a certain generation became, here it is, people, here's our how-to sexuality guide and that sort of thing. What we don't remember is that with all, clinics and studies and universities, they have to have a sponsor. They have to have someone who's going to underwrite it. The person who underwrote it at that time was a very little-known man by the name of Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner was the guy who would later be the founder of Playboy, which was probably the first legitimate introduction to pornography in our society. And, compared to what is now online, Playboy could have been a children's book except for the fold-out, okay? But anyway, that's now coming of age in our country. It's starting to be acceptable. Respectable people were engaging in that. Here again, what are we doing? We're looking at pornography. Why? Because it gives us a secondary pleasure, okay? And whatever you do that follows that pleasure, that's all of what's going on. Just a little sidebar here. During the pandemic, there's a website called Pornhub. Pornhub is your one-stop shop for all things pornographic, okay? And when you go to Pornhub, you can get left-handed lesbians doing whatever you want them to do, okay? I mean, it's crazy. You know what the largest demographic during the pandemic was to access Pornhub? 10 to 14-year-old little boys. You know what that says? We were all curious at that age. But at home, people don't swing from the chandeliers, okay? But when you got these children having their so-called education about marriage and love and human sexuality being educated on Pornhub, what does that say about marriage and family for the future of this generation? We can fast forward to the 1960. In 1960, there was 4.2% of the entire American population was born outside of wedlock. Okay? 1963, JFK is assassinated. 1964, LBJ is president. And LBJ starts to create what he calls a Great War on Poverty. 1964, 18% of the people were living in poverty. He has spent $3 trillion on the war on poverty. Today, they're 15% living in poverty. But let me tell you what he did. He went in, and he went into the underserved communities, regardless of your race or whatever, but the underserved communities living in poverty. He had housing, he had food stamps, he had diapers, he had WICs, he had all kind of government assistance that he was going to now help people come out of poverty if there wasn't a husband living in the house. If there was a husband, you got none of these benefits. Today, one group has 74% of the children are born out of wedlock. The rest of everyone else is 48% born out of wedlock. We went in and systematically destroyed the family. In 1967, Pope Paul VI issued an encyclical entitled Humane Vitae. Magnificent, magnificent treatise on the dignity of the human person from the moment of conception to the moment of natural birth, or natural death. But it never got fully implemented and evangelized. It became the birth control document. The Pope says the pill is a no-no. And the 13th chapter, he has this wonderful thing about that God has entrusted human sexuality to man, but man does not have dominion over his human sexuality because God is the author and the creator of life, and man is called to cooperate with that. I'm in the seminary, 1976, and we're talking about artificial contraception versus natural. Having a hard time figuring it out. I called a young priest who's a classmate of my brother's, and I said, what's the big deal between artificial and natural? And it's 1976, and he says, well, if you chemically alter your body not to have children, and if having sex is the only purpose of marriage, then how come two men can't marry, two women can't marry? 1976. I said, dude, what are you smoking? I mean, two men get married. Never heard of that. Now the breakdown. Now we look at where we are. We're buying and selling human beings. We have a generation of people who think killing the preborn is a constitutional right and needs to be protected. Those same people, and I've seen it when I've given this talk. Given the talk, everyone's right there with me. When I start talking about abortion, there's a certain part of the audience that just tunes out. You can see it. And when I see it, I say, well, let me ask you something. You're here for this talk because you're outraged that children are being bought and sold for sexual purposes. And you should be. But you're not outraged that we kill them before they even get to the point of being born? Explain me, Lucy. This makes no sense. And so it's a challenge. And it's a challenge our society faces. And just like the drugs we chase instead of the question of happiness, until we work in our society to restore the internal dignity of everyone made in the image and likeness of God and made for God and made to be with God, we're going to keep chasing the traffickers, and more often than not, we're going to lose. Thanks for being with us today. May each day bring you closer in your walk with the Lord. God bless.